Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on Advocacy 101. I'm Ilsa Connect, Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Joyful Heart Foundation. From the work that we're doing in legislatures across the country, we know just how much your voice can move rape kit reform. We're thrilled to partner today with All In Together on this webinar on how exactly to take action. This webinar will be presented by Colleen O'Gorman, Community Manager at All In Together, and Lily Rocha, Policy and Advocacy Manager at Joyful Heart. Please feel free to ask questions in the question and answer box, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and distributed after the event. Thank you again for joining, and now I'll turn it over to Colleen to begin.
Great, thank you so much, Ilsa. Hi everyone, my name is Colleen O'Gorman, and I'm the Community Manager at All In Together. And All In Together is we are a civic engagement organization for women. We do workshops and training for voting age American women with action-oriented, nonpartisan civic education to realize their full potential as leaders shaping our nation. And so what that means in practice is that we do workshops and trainings all over the country to help women raise their voice on the issues that matter to them, whether it's ending the backlog of untested rape kits around the country or whatever issues are the most important to them. And we're so excited to be doing this webinar with the Joyful Heart this afternoon.
Thank you, Colleen. So a little bit about the Joyful Heart Foundation. We started in 2004 after thousands of fans were reaching out to Mariska Hargitay for her role as Detective Olivia Benson on Law & Order at SVU. So Mariska felt compelled to help these survivors who were reaching out, and she started this organization to do just that. Our vision is to see a world free of sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse. And our mission is to transform society's response to sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse, support survivors' healing, and end this violence forever. So in order to enact this and make sure that we are working on behalf of survivors, we have enacted a 50-state campaign to eliminate the backlog across every state and also prioritize the needs and rights of survivors. So since 2010, this has been our top advocacy priority, and we've been working with local stakeholders, advocates, survivors, law enforcement, crime labs, prosecutors, and the general public interested in making a difference. We're excited to have been able to work in several states, including Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Kentucky, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Texas, Utah, and Washington. And so we're thrilled to be here today to tell you exactly how you can take action. So today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the rape kit backlog so you have a sense of the issue. Then from that, I'll turn it over to Colleen, who will talk about tools for influence. She'll go over civics refresher, advocacy tactics, and strategic engagement. Then we'll wrap it up with some final thoughts and next steps. And then at the very end, we'll take your questions. In the meantime, please do feel free to join the conversation. We'd love it if you do it, actually. You can do it on Twitter at All In Together, at the JHF, and the Backlog. You do it on Facebook, AI Together, or Joyful Heart, as well as on Instagram. So go ahead, take your pick, and make sure that you're joining the conversation with us on social media. So to start off, we're here to talk about the rape kit backlog, but what exactly is the rape kit backlog? So to give some background, every 98 seconds, someone is sexually assaulted in the United States. After the assault, a survivor can have a medical forensic exam performed, and this is usually a 4 to 6 hour, very invasive, exhaustive procedure where the survivor's body is photographed, picked over for evidence, swabbed, and generally managed as a crime scene. We do see that after this event, after this exam, survivors may want to report this and may want to send the kit for testing and have DNA extracted. So forensic analysis may yield a DNA profile which can be uploaded to the national database, the Combined DNA Index System. There at the lab, Matches can be made to other DNA profiles in CODIS, identifying offenders and serial rapists. So you're able to connect matches between kits and between suspects and between serial offenders who are perpetrating and committing these crimes against multiple victims. The problem is that too often these rape kits are collected by the medical facility. They can be sent to law enforcement. Law enforcement may not submit them, and then once submitted, these kits may not be tested. So right now, over 225,000 untested kits have been uncovered, but the full extent remains unknown. This approximation comes from journalistic inquiries, it comes from some state audits, as well as our own accountability project where we submit open records requests to jurisdictions to obtain the number of untested kits. But again, the full extent throughout the country is not known. So when we talk about this, we ask ourselves, why did it happen? Well, you know, to be very blunt and to put it out there, crimes against women have not been taken seriously or prioritized. And this leads to some law enforcement bias and maybe not believing a victim, maybe interrogating the suspect in a way that doesn't believe them, makes them feel guilty, makes them feel shamed. And we see that a lot of these interrogative techniques aren't really understanding about the knowledge of and the impact of trauma on victim behavior and memory. So a survivor who has just been through this horrific experience will be traumatized, and that's going to affect how they answer questions, how they remember time sequence, how they exude their emotions, and it may or may not be in line with what law enforcement believes as a credible or cooperative victim. But if we know a little bit about trauma and how it impacts us, we can lead to better techniques, to better survivor-centric approaches, and to having more survivors trusting law enforcement. Another reason why this happens is a lack of knowledge about the power of DNA. Oftentimes we'll hear that if the suspect is known, they may not need DNA to test. However, we say that when you test the kits and when you upload them to the national database, you may in fact see connections to other cases. And oftentimes we see that serial rapists commit crimes against people they know. So it could be an acquaintance, it could be a spouse, it could be a friend, and also against people that they don't know. So being able to have that DNA make those connections is of paramount importance. And lastly, we do have to acknowledge that at times there has been a lack of resources. This has not been a priority in the past for law enforcement, crime labs, and state legislatures to fund. And so we must make sure that with upcoming reforms that law enforcement, prosecutors, victim advocates, and crime labs have all the resources they need to be able to process this DNA evidence and be able to work with survivors through the criminal justice system. And we do have some great resources for you guys. You can visit endthebacklog.org. It is the premier site on the Rape Kit Backlog. We have information about every state and Washington, D.C. So you can go to your state's page and learn more. It'll look like what you see here for New York. I just pulled it up because it is our home state. And there you can find about the 6 pillars of reform, which I'll talk about briefly. And you can also learn about recent legislation, pending bills, and non-legislative reforms. We do acknowledge that reforms happen outside of the legislature, such as, for example, getting a grant to take on this work, or having the governor or the attorney general decide to take on account of the untested kits. And we laud and applaud all of those achievements, and we hope to see more of that throughout the country. So to talk a little bit more of how do we fix this, we have 6 pillars of legislative reform. These are really 6 legislative solutions that when enacted and implemented to the extent, the intent of the law, they are going to help eliminate the backlog, prevent backlogs from happening again, and prioritize the needs and rights of survivors. So the first pillar, I'll just go through these very quickly, is an annual audit, making sure that we're counting how many kits are in law enforcement possessions, are in the crime labs, how many of those have been untested, and providing a yearly snapshot for the public to make sure that we're able to monitor progress on how we're tackling the backlog. The next thing is to test backlog kits. So having the state come in and pass a law that says we need to test these kits really gets things going in states. Right now, only 9 states have this law, so we'd like to work on getting more testing backlog legislation in place. The next pillar is test newly collected kits. So in order to prevent another backlog from happening again, we have strict timelines about when kits should be collected by law enforcement, when kits should be submitted to a lab, and when kits should be tested. Making sure that we have these time frames really prevents the backlog from occurring, but also lets survivors know that we're never going to let this happen again, that it was a mistake, and we will fix it. The next thing is a tracking system. So a rape kit tracking system would follow the rape kit from the collection process all the way to disposition. We have various states taking it on a little differently, but essentially these tracking systems would allow survivors to come in and anonymously and securely track where their kit is at any time. This gives them information about where their kits are, and it also allows them to have control about how much information they would like and when they would like to receive it. It also allows state legislatures to pull up reports, to inventory what they have, and to be able to provide some transparency on the issue. Next is allowing states to grant rights to notice. So granting the rights to survivors to know where their kits are and to have updates on that information. Also having someone either in law enforcement or with the prosecutors who can be a contact person for them so they'd never feel lost in the criminal justice system. This is of extreme importance and definitely one of the pillars that we feel is the most survivor-centric approach to the backlog. And lastly, as I mentioned, we need funding. The state legislature does need to appropriate funding to carry out all these forms. They need to put money in and invest. And what we've seen is that jurisdictions who do invest and put money to test the kits, prosecute the cases, and investigate the cases, as well as provide survivor support, in the long run, communities save money. This happens because you're apprehending offenders, and so you're preventing future crimes from occurring. And when you prevent future crimes, that's less resources that are being used on the criminal justice system. So in the end, it's a really great investment for the state to make. So why we're here today is because your voice is what drives legislation. Working with legislators across the country, we definitely have a ton of research. We have resources, we have webinars, we have presentations, we have model legislation, but what really can bring the point home and really humanize the issue is being able to hear from somebody who is passionate about this. And in particular, I do have survivors. Survivors have this unique ability to speak about the issue the way nobody else can. But I should note that advocacy may not be for all survivors, or it may be at different points in their journey. And you should be free and you should feel confident to be able to say your story if you would like to, whenever you would like to, and you have control over that. Also, anybody who works with survivors, such as SANEs, rape crisis counselors, even law enforcement, anybody who works with them and sees how this impacts humans and people day to day, your voice is really powerful as well. So just keep in mind that these populations have definitely a lot of leverage in how legislation moves. But of course, anybody, just even being a citizen, being outraged about the issue, your voice can make a difference. So now I'll turn it over to Colleen, who will give you some tools and some guidance on how to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lily. I'm excited to turn it over to Tools for Influence. And before I do that, just really want to reemphasize what Lily said about that it is our voices as members of this democracy who are really going to make changes on these issues that are so urgent and important to all of us. So with that goal in mind, let's jump into Tools for Influence. So we just went over the rape kit backlog and all of the information you need to really go to your legislators and talk to them about these issues. So now we're going to talk about the tools of what really works in these conversations. So the first step to advocating on behalf of these issues that you care about is to do your research, right? All of you are listening in, taking an hour out of your day to listen to this webinar because this is already an issue you care about. And Lily just gave us some great information about the issue and what great talking points you can have when you're calling your representatives. But the next piece of the puzzle is to actually know who represents you. And why this is so important is because whether we like it or not, a democracy means that the people who are elected to represent us, those are the only people whose job it is to listen to what we have to say about policy. So for example, if you're like me and live in New York, it probably won't make that much of an impact if you call a state legislator in Ohio, right? Because even if you are excited about this issue, if they don't ultimately, represent you, they're less likely to listen to what you have to say just because that's their job. So really important to know exactly who represents you. And if you don't already know who represents you, especially at the state level, don't worry. As you can see, almost 80% of Americans can't name a single senator who represents them in his or her state. So we have a lot of work to do, but there's a really easy way to find out who represents you. And it's one of my favorite things we do at All In Together. We have this awesome action center. If you go onto our website at aitogether.org/action center, you can find this really cool tool to find out exactly who represents you, as well as tips and tricks about how to most effectively advocate on your issues to your legislators. So when you first log in, you'll see a page like this. As you can see, my name is already in that top right corner of the screen, because if you log in and create an account, if you plug in your zip code, it'll tell you exactly who represents you. So if we go to this next slide, you can see that I live in Brooklyn, so my senators, my representative in Congress, but also my state legislators also pop up in the Action Center. And when you're advocating on behalf of ending the rape kit backlog, you really want to be focusing in on these state senators and your state representatives, right? Because those are the people who are making policy on the state level. And so if you click in further, say I want to click into my state senator, Senator Kevin Parker. And as you can see, there's a little bit of a biographical information about him here. And these three buttons at the bottom, I can write him, I can call him, I can even schedule a visit. I'll talk a little bit more in just a few minutes about tactics for each of these three ways to get in touch, but it's right here on the Action Center, so easy for you to get in touch with your state reps. Another thing you can do is do a little bit more research on the people who represent you. As you can see on our Action Center, we also have recent legislation that they've voted on or sponsored, as well as if you click into their website, you can look into a little more about what their policy priorities are. And I'll say, just as you click in to see if they're doing anything already about the rape kit backlog, that might be hidden in a couple of different spaces. It might not say directly, oh, Senator Parker is working on the rape kit backlog, but if you go into say what his judicial priorities, things like that, you might find a little bit more information about your representative's views on how sexual assault survivors ought to be treated in the criminal justice system. So great, now that you've gone into the Action Center and found out who represents you, you can actually start to reach out to them. And so, well, even before you reach out to them really, there's a couple of things you can do to make it even easier to know when is a good time to reach out to them. So one thing I do is I set up Google News alerts for all of my political officials, both at the federal and the state level. And that could get a little bit overwhelming just because our representatives are active on a lot of issues all of the time, but you can set up a Google News alert with their name and say, end the backlog or rape kit backlog to see if anything pops up if they act on these issues. Another thing you can do to be prepared is when you go into their website to look into their campaign contributions, their voting records, and their social media accounts, also to get a sense of what they prioritize so you're a little bit more prepared going into a conversation with them to advocate on behalf of the issues you care about. So diving right in, time to engage. So now that you know a little bit more about the rape kit backlog, you know who represents you, let's talk a little bit about how to effectively advocate on behalf of this issue. So probably the easiest and still very effective advocacy tactic you can do is to write personalized letters and emails or make a phone call. And your tactics for both written and a phone call conversation are going to be pretty similar. But if you also see other ways to engage, right, on the far right, we see the kind of least effective way to engage, right, are these form email messages that you might find from advocacy organizations. And as you can see, it's not that they have no influence. About half of people who work in representatives' offices say that they have a lot or some influence on the representative's ultimate decision to vote on a piece of policy. But as you can see, phone calls, individualized mail, individualized email has a lot more impact. And in fact, what has the most impact is if you go to an in-person visit to the person who represents you. 94% of people who work in representatives' offices say that this has a lot or some influence on how their representative will ultimately vote on an issue. And kind of the big takeaway from this graph, as you can see, right, is the more time and effort you put in, the more impact you'll have. And really what that means is if you have the time, if you have the energy, if this is the issue you want to spend the most of your advocacy time on, it might make sense for you to schedule an in-person visit with your representative, or especially at the state level, you'd be surprised how excited they are to get coffee with their constituents and really get to know them, especially because at the state level, they really do represent fewer people, so they have a little more time with these things. But that's not to say that the form email messages don't have impact. It's just that if you have the time and effort, it's better spent really individualizing your calls, individualizing your emails, and making the time to schedule those in-person visits. But now, so if you do have time to make an effective call to your representatives, we recommend that you take these 5 specific steps that are research-backed to have the most impact that you can. So the first thing you do when you call your representative, make sure that you identify your name and your zip code. And as I was saying earlier, the reason why it's so important to identify your zip code is to make sure that your representative's office knows that you are a constituent, that it is their job to represent you. Without that zip code, they may not be as ready to record or take seriously what you have to say if you're not a constituent. So that first step is very important. The second step I would recommend is to state your call to action. So as Lily was talking about those 6 pillars for legislation around this issue, that's what you want to bring up here. And also, so those are the specific policies that are important, but what is a call to action? A call to action can really only be one of 3 things. You can ask your legislator to vote a certain way, you can ask them to co-sponsor a bill, or you can ask them to release a statement. And I want to emphasize that it's really important to state a specific call to action, because otherwise, right, your legislator, you know, it's all fine and good if you care about this issue and they care about this issue, but if you don't give them a specific action step to take, there's not much that they can do. The third step that I'd recommend is to wait for their response. And really what this goes into is who is on the other line of the call, right? Typically the people who work the phones in your representative's office, they're young people, maybe an intern or it's their first job out of school, and they are eager to serve their community in this public service job. But they're not there to quiz you on how much you know about the backlog. They're not there to disagree with you, even if your representative may not hold the same position as you do. Really here, it's about having a civil conversation with them, just because as important as it can be to be motivated by anger and all of the emotions that come with this really urgent issue, I think talking to them as they are, which is, you know, a young person who wants to serve their community, is the most effective way to have a tone for this conversation. The fourth step I would recommend is to tell your story. And this can mean a lot of things. As Lily said earlier, you are in control totally of how much or how little you want to share with your legislator. Your story is your story, and however much or little you want to tell is 100% up to you. And there's a lot of impact you can have by emphasizing either different parts of your story or emphasizing how the backlog affects your community specifically. But just to make sure to give them strong motivation as to why they should care about this issue. And finally, the last step here is to ask for your opinion to be recorded. One thing that we know is because your representative won't actually be the person on the other line, their decisions will be impacted by how many people are calling their office to talk to them about this specific issue. So if they hear that 20 people called today and talked about the backlog, that's when they're going to take notice. So make sure that your voice is being recorded among everyone else who cares about this issue, right? Because it takes a lot of people to form a movement around these really important issues. And finally, just a little pro tip about making time to make these calls, right? Because this isn't just a one and done thing. Just save your representative's phone number in your cell phone. I know it can be really easy to find 5 minutes in the morning, say when you're walking from the parking lot into where you work, just take those 5 minutes when you're walking to call your representative. And if it's right there in your phone, you make it easy just whenever you have a couple minutes, whenever you think about it, to just call, right? Because as you can see, these 5 steps really aren't that labor intensive. And once you already know what you're going to say, this is something that you can very easily do 5 minutes in the morning or afternoon. And one thing I want to also emphasize as we're talking about these specific engagement tips, right, is if you compare how important these strategies are versus how many people actually use these strategies, right? So at 91% for how helpful information about the impacts the bill would have on the district or the state, right? 91% of people in representatives' office to say that this is so helpful, but only 9% of constituents talk about the impact in their calls. Similarly, only 18% of constituents will tell a personal story related to a bill or issue when they call in, but it's 79% effective, right? So keeping in mind these numbers and keeping in mind that it's these personal touches that are really important but don't always get mentioned. So what's next? Now that we've talked through some of the specific advocacy steps you can take, let's talk about 3 things you can do after this webinar to make an impact on this issue. So first, the pro tip I said earlier, make it as easy as you can to contact and monitor your state elected officials. So the first step of that is to find out who your state elected is, and you can do that by logging on to our Action Center at aitogether.org/Action Center. Just go ahead and save their phone numbers in your cell phone so that if you have a spare minute to talk about the backlog, that you're ready to do that wherever you are and you don't have to log into the Action Center every time you want to do that. Create a Google News alert with their name and also one for the backlog in your state so that you're always up to date on the news related to this issue. And finally, to follow them on social media or sign up for their mailing list over email to always be in the know about what your legislator, what actions they're taking on these issues. The second recommended action step is to just put aside time to engage. One thing I do is that every week on my calendar, I just make myself a little appointment for just 30 minutes of advocacy time, and I use that time either to reach out and schedule an appointment with my elected official, or I'll take that time to call them about the issues I care about. And if you schedule that time in, you're more likely to do it. And we have this great link here on how to contact your legislatures through the End the Backlog website. And so that can be one of the things that you can use your advocacy time for. And finally, the last recommended action step is to think global but act local. As we've already seen, right, around this issue of the backlog, even though it's a national problem, we know that the solutions are going to come at the state and local level. So it's important to engage through a local meeting or a public hearing or campaign in your state, in your district, right at home in your community. You can make a huge impact if you start at home. And if you are interested in learning more about what's going on in your specific community around policy, feel free to email policy@joyfulheartfoundation.org for more information and ways to get involved. So those are the action steps that I have. Thank you so much to the Joyful Heart for having me here. And I think we can move along and answer any questions that everyone has.
So one question, Colleen, that we got is most elected officials have two numbers, a local number and one in DC or the state capital. Is one more effective than the other?
Absolutely. So both of them are effective. I know on this current issue, right, you want to be focusing on your state legislators on most issues related to the backlog. So you'll be wanting to call their office at the state level and their local office. But feel free to call both to make sure that your voice is being heard everywhere. I wouldn't say that one is more effective than the other.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm looking for this.
Yeah, sure.
So can we get a copy of these slides, please? Yes.
Absolutely. We will be following up in an email after the webinar, and we'll make sure that everyone has these slides so they have the awesome information about the backlog as well as these advocacy tips.
Great. I believe somebody has a question of, I have personal connections to a lot of my state legislators. Can I get a bill language for them to use? Yes. We have that actually on endthebacklog.org. If you go to our approach and go to our campaign, we have a webpage with our entire 6 pillars legislative campaign. And from there, you can download model legislation. So this gives legislators an idea and a good starting point of what does the bill actually look like? What does it say? And this is tremendously helpful to a lot of legislators who might be like, oh, I really want to take action on this. I just don't know what the solutions are. You can be like, point them to our website. You can download the model legislation as well. You can send it to them. And if you have any questions, you can always email us at policy@joyfulheartfoundation.org.
And it looks like there's a couple, we have a couple questions from listeners about the backlog specifically. If I can ask you, Lily, it looks like Terry is, he works for law enforcement in the county, and I'll just read what Terry wrote. I just found out that even if a rape kit is done, it can only be tested if the survivor wants to proceed with the charge. And rape kits are only stored for 2 years. Is it like that everywhere?
It varies by jurisdiction, by state actually. Just here in New York, the governor signed the budget bill, which included a change in how long kits were retained. Up until a couple weeks ago, rape kits were actually only retained 30 days, and they could be retained a little bit longer, pending discussions with the survivor, but on the 31st day, the rape kit could legally be thrown out. Right now, that has been changed to 20 years. So rape kits will be stored in a centralized location that the stakeholders in the state will be determining. And so rape kit or survivors will now have up to 20 years to decide if they would like to file reports with law enforcement and go through the criminal justice process. So if you want to find out what's happening in your state, again, I would go to endthebacklog.org and look for your state, and you can find a ton of information there on if there's been any evidence retention policies that have been changed. But that's definitely something that we'd like to work on as well, and it is one of our best practices that we have, making sure that we have evidence retention laws that are at least up to the statute of limitations or longer, in line with federal best practices. But we do need the evidence in order to be able to test it, so it makes sense to have strong retention policies.
Great. So it looks like we have another couple questions either around advocacy or about the backlog. More specifically, so one question from Colin from Truman High School asks, is how students can become more involved in terms of bringing awareness and being able to help and possibly bring some sort of comfort to survivors. So I can speak to the advocacy around legislation piece. Colin, just all of the strategies that I talked about for calling your legislators about these issues are all strategies that you can use as a student. And I also want to emphasize that a lot of these strategies that you can use to call your legislators, if you're interested in changing, say, policy on your campus about how your high school deals with sexual assault, you can also advocate to your school administrators or to the school board. Do you have anything specifically to add to, Lily?
No, I think you basically covered it all, Colleen, but it definitely makes a big difference, to hear from young students who are activists who are passionate about an issue. And, if there's any way that we can be helpful, please let us know. But we would definitely appreciate having students being involved in this movement. Great.
Another question is from Debbie, who asks, is there an easy way to research if bills are already in progress in my state? Or if they're active or dying in committee, et cetera?
Yeah, so definitely on endthebacklog.org on the state page, we keep a list of pending legislation and where it is, whether it's in a committee, whether it's been voted on, if it's going to the governor, if the governor has signed it. So that's definitely a great way. You could also go to your legislature's website and search by bill numbers. We do have the bill numbers listed on our website, so that would be a good place to start if you're like, I don't know what a bill number is, or I don't know how to get it. We do have it on our website, and you're welcome to use your state's legislative portal to be able to find that information as well. So there's really two different ways to go about it, but I would definitely say, if you wanted a little bit more readable and a little bit more user-friendly, we definitely aim to do that on our website.
Yeah, that sounds like a really awesome resource. Another question we've gotten is, I know we want to stay away from form letters and emails, but are there any examples that you can share so that we can get a feel for creating our own? And I would say that in letters and emails, just like on the phone calls, you want to include everything that I talked about earlier, right? So include your name and zip code so that your representative knows that you're a constituent. Include your call to action. So if you want them to co-sponsor a bill, to vote a certain way, to release a statement, make sure that call to action is in there. I know we talked about waiting for a response. That's not as relevant, right, in a letter and email. But telling your story or talking about why their action on this issue or this bill would have impact in your community, or how it's already impacted you, is something that is the most important thing that you can do in an email or a letter, so definitely include that. And finally, to ask that someone records the correspondence are all things that, just as you want to include them in a phone call, include those in your letters and emails.
Great. And we have a specific question that for a state, but I think it gets to a little bit bigger issue of why we need an annual inventory. Somebody from Alabama said, there is no information on my state and Alabama on endthebacklog.org. How do I go about finding these numbers? Well, actually, if you go to the Alabama page, you see that the number of untested kits is unknown. Right now, we don't have legislation that says the state law enforcement officials, as well as crime labs, have to count how many untested kits they have. So we don't have that number. And that's why we advocate for annual inventories. And as you can see in the Alabama page, once you visit it, there is legislation pending on that. So one way to start advocating is to do some research on the bill, go to the page, find out where it's happening, and call your representative. And there you have an ask. I'd like you to support this bill. I'd like you to move forward with the bill and vote yes. So definitely encourage you all to take a look. But yeah, it is tough to get a lot of this information, which is why we're here, to make sure that we put this in the law and we get transparent about how we're handling rape kits.
Great. So it looks like there are a couple more questions specific about the backlog. One of the questions specifically is about having lots of untested rape kits, but that it averages $1,200 to $1,500 to test one kit. And the question is this true, and how we can assist in funding another person in these labs to test these kits?
Yeah, so it's about $1,000 to $1,500 on average to test a kit. It does vary by jurisdiction, but yes, there are fundraising efforts throughout the country. I know Texas has done a great job of creating like a CrowdRise campaign to be able to donate to the testing of the rape kit backlog. And New Mexico has also done it, and a few states have also looked into this as well. And we definitely applaud those efforts. Those are definitely a grassroots way to get this issue moving and get the funds necessary for this reform. We say that we should also be urging the state legislature to make this a priority. So making sure that the legislator, as they're debating the budget and deciding how much to invest in every part of the public service goods, that they're able to invest money in testing rape kits. Again, it increases public safety, it gets offenders off the streets, and also importantly, it tells survivors that they matter. We made mistakes, and we as a system have failed them, so now it's time to make sure that we're investing the resources to correct that mistake. But yes, I think one thing to do when you're asking and calling your legislator is asking for the reforms, but then also asking for the funding to go along with it.
Great. Another question, we have a survivor who's asking if she can also advocate for laws regarding destruction of evidence. It sounds like she had an experience where there was no rape kit done, and she's interested in advocating on destruction of evidence. Are there any policies on the state level around that, Lily?
Yeah, so evidence retention, again, is on a state-by-state level. So that is going to be something that your state does through the laws. And again, in New York, we just recently changed that, so we're celebrating that big win for survivors from 30 days to 20 years. And there are federal best practices on how long kits should be retained if they're anonymous, if they're not. So we do say that you can definitely advocate on that, and it's one of our best practices as well. So we have these 6 pillars, but if you actually go into our legislative handbook, which you can find on our webpage, again, endthebacklog.org, look in our approach and look in our campaign, you will find our legislative handbook that outlines what evidence retention should look like and talks a little bit more about that. But you're right, this is something that needs to be addressed as well, again, because we need the evidence to be able to test it. Absolutely. And it looks like we have 2 similar questions about trainings and future similar trainings to this one. One person has a question about trainings for young people to either become a rape crisis counselor or a person of some support to survivors. And there's also a question about trainings on #EndTheBacklog for with a train the trainer model. So people who are listening in who want to go out into their community and go out and speak can make sure that they're giving an accurate reflection of the problem. Do you have any sense of future trainings either on End the Backlog or supportive? That's definitely something that we'd like to consider and make sure that we're engaging the community and really putting out the best practices and current research out there. In the meantime, I would suggest that you find endthebacklog.org. You will see a webinar that we did just a few months ago, actually, on this issue. So it goes a little bit more in depth than what I went in. So this is more of a condensed version of what I just presented, but it gives you the overall view of what's happened and why we're here and what the legislative solutions do exactly. So if you'd like to host a training, you can definitely email us and we see how we can be helpful. But in the meantime, if you'd like to explore this issue a little bit more, definitely check out that webinar that we have on our website. Somebody also, I think, asked a question, I think, via email about I Am Evidence. As you guys know, our president and founder, Mariska Hargitay, worked and produced a documentary with HBO called I Am Evidence, and it follows survivors who were neglected and who were failed by the system, ultimately. And it talks about their story and follows them through that process. It's a very powerful film. And it was released on HBO on April 16th. So if you have HBO, I recommend that you go in there and look at and watch it. You can also host a watch party. So what we had on April 16th is around the country we had hundreds of people tune in and host watch parties, meaning that they got their friends and family together. They had some talking points. They had some questions for discussion, and so it was really a wonderful experience for people to be able to use that tool as a learning experience. And then again, to kind of supplement that, because I think that leaves people with a lot of desire to take action, is looking over this webinar and saying, what are some of the tools that we do next? It's finding out who our legislators are, recording their numbers on our phone, finding out what exactly is happening in our state. So some states have the full 6 pillars. I think somebody commented from Texas that Texas, has the full 6 pillars, but there is still more work to be done. And so, looking at what's exactly needed in my state, where can we help, and what is appropriate for this moment.
Yeah. Another question from Molly is there something that those of us in law enforcement can do above and beyond the advocacy tactics to help with ending the backlog?
Yeah, I think that's amazing that we have law enforcement, and we've seen it around the country too. We're actually technical assistance providers on a federal grant called the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, SAKI. And part of this work has allowed us to travel across the country and talk to these multidisciplinary teams of law enforcement, crime labs, prosecutors, victim advocates, and survivors about this issue. And we've seen that oftentimes, there are law enforcement officials out there who want to take responsibility for this and want to do better. So I think one thing to do is, talking with your leadership within your agency and talking to them about, what does it look like to invest resources to your sex crimes unit, to be able to have interview training for survivors, and make sure that you understand the impact of trauma on survivors as you interrogate them. And also looking at, what other resources might be available to you. The International Association of Chiefs of Police, IACP, I believe on their website has some modules for training on that. So I recommend that you go there as well.
Great. Another question is related to sexual assault on college campuses from Jasmine, and she asks, what should the role of colleges and universities be in addressing the rape kit backlog within their state, particularly because Title IX compliance for a campus does not necessarily equate to kits being tested from survivors on a college campus?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great question, and we have worked with, End Rape on campus on this issue, and talk to them a little bit to learn more about what's going on in campuses. And while we don't exclusively focus on that realm, what I think really survivors and the college students, faculty, administrators, anybody who's on this campus and wants to take action is, thinking about how do we put our voices together. Is it maybe sending a letter to your elected official? Is it maybe holding a meeting with them? Is it maybe making a call together, having a call party where you guys all take turns and call your elected officials? So there's definitely ways that you guys can organize and make sure that you can take action. And sorry, just quickly, I want to go back to the law enforcement piece too, real quickly. Contact your legislator as a law enforcement official if you can. There might be certain rules around that, but if you're able to do that, if this is something that you would be able to do, is contact your legislators and letting them know that you support this. Oftentimes, legislators, as they're taking on solutions, they want to check in with different people who will be impacted by the legislation. So, how will this impact nurses who collect the rape kits? How is this going to impact the lab? How is this going to impact law enforcement? So just knowing that law enforcement wants to take this on and wants the reform will signal to legislators that this is something that can be done. So, you definitely have a strong voice there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that is so true. Let's see, and I know I'm looking through, and it looks like we don't have any more questions that we haven't answered. Lily, do you have any kind of final thoughts before we close?
I just want to thank you all, first of all, for being here and for being willing to be a part of this movement. We really can't do it without you. It takes so much effort on the behalf of so many people to make any change. And so thank you all so much for listening today. Again, if you have any more questions, you can send us an email at policy@joyfulheartfoundation.org. And we can see how we can be of help. In the meantime, again, check out all our resources online. Spend a little time on the website. Maybe that could be part of your 30 minutes to engage, is to just spend 30 minutes doing research on the issue. And so I just want to thank you all so much for coming, and I believe that we can do this. I believe that there's a lot of momentum. We see it and hear from a lot more legislators who want to make a difference for survivors, who want to correct the injustices. And so I believe that we all come together, I think we can make it happen.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Lily. This was so wonderful, and I hope this is just the beginning of a really important conversation.
Yes, thank you too, Colleen. I really appreciate you being here. And thank you all. So have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.